Chapter 1: The Depression Child. The year was 1930, and America was drowning. Not in water, but in desperation. The stock market crash of 1929 had sent shockwaves through every town, every home, every heart. In San Francisco, California, on May 31st, Ruth Runner Eastwood felt the first contractions in the charity ward of a hospital that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. Her husband, Clint Eastwood Sr., paced outside, his shoes worn thin from walking the streets looking for work that didn't exist. When the nurses finally emerged with news of a healthy baby boy, Clinton Sr. managed a tired smile. They would name him Clinton Eastwood Jr., though everyone would come to call him Clint. The world this child entered was one of bread lines and broken dreams. The Eastwood family lived in a small apartment in the working-class neighborhoods of Oakland, where the fog rolled in thick from the bay and seemed to carry with it the weight of uncertainty. Clinton Sr. had been a manufacturing executive before the crash, a man who wore press suits and carried a leather briefcase. Now, he took whatever work he could find: gas station attendant, truck driver, laborer. The family moved constantly, chasing rumors of employment up and down the California coast like tumbleweeds blown by an economic drought. Young Clint grew up understanding instability as the only constant. By the time he was 10 years old, he had attended schools in Sacramento, Pacific Palisades, Piedmont, and small towns whose names he would later struggle to remember. He was always the new kid, always trying to read the social landscape of yet another schoolyard, another set of bullies, another hierarchy to navigate. The experience carved something into him: a wariness, a self-reliance, an ability to observe before acting that would later become his trademark. His mother Ruth, a woman with Swedish and Irish ancestry, possessed a quiet strength that kept the family together during those nomadic years. She didn't complain when they packed up again, didn't cry when Clinton Sr. came home with news of another move. Instead, she would wrap their meager possessions in newspaper, her hands steady, her jaw set. Clint watched her closely during these times, learning what stoicism looked like, how dignity could survive even when everything else was stripped away. The boy was tall for his age, gangly and awkward, with a shock of light brown hair that refused to stay combed. He wasn't particularly athletic, wasn't the smartest in class, wasn't anything special by conventional measures. But he had eyes that watched everything, that took in the subtle mechanics of human behavior with an intensity that made some adults uncomfortable. When other kids played, Clint often stood at the periphery, absorbing rather than participating, cataloging the patterns of social interaction like a young anthropologist. School bored him. The constant relocations meant he was always behind or ahead in different subjects, never quite synchronized with the curriculum. Teachers noted his intelligence but also his distraction, his tendency to stare out windows at the world beyond the classroom walls. What they didn't know was that Clint was already living in stories, daydreams of cowboys and adventure, of a stability and purpose that his real life lacked. He devoured Western novels and adventure stories, losing himself in narratives of men who faced challenges with quiet competence, who let their actions speak louder than their words. World War II arrived when Clint was 11, and with it came a strange kind of opportunity for families like the Eastwoods. Clinton Sr. found work in defense plants and shipyards, and for the first time in Clint's memory, there was enough money for more than just survival. The family settled in Piedmont, a community near Oakland, and for a few precious years, life achieved something approaching normalcy. Clint attended Piedmont Middle School and then Piedmont High School, finally able to put down roots, however shallow. But adolescence brought its own complications. Clint shot up to 6 feet 4 inches, his frame filling out but still carrying that characteristic leanness. He wasn't a joiner, didn't play football, didn't run for student council, didn't chase the conventional markers of high school success. Instead, he found solace in music, teaching himself to play piano by ear, his long fingers finding patterns on the keys that his mind couldn't quite articulate in words. He worked odd jobs, delivering papers, lifeguarding at the community pool, pumping gas, always earning, always saving, though he couldn't have said exactly what he was saving for. The other students at Piedmont High saw him as something of an enigma. He dated occasionally, had friends, but kept everyone at a certain distance. There was a self-containment about him, a sense that he was holding something in reserve. Years later, classmates would struggle to remember specific stories about him, recalling instead an impression, tall, quiet, present but somehow absent, as if he were already looking toward a horizon they couldn't see. In 1949, Clint graduated from high school with unremarkable grades and no clear plan. His parents, relieved that he'd finished, expected him to find steady work, perhaps in the manufacturing sector that had sustained them. But Clint had other ideas, though they were more feelings than concrete ambitions. He enrolled at Los Angeles City College, ostensibly to study business management, but his heart wasn't in it. He attended classes sporadically, spent more time working at a gas station on La Brea Avenue, watching the parade of humanity that came through, the dreamers heading to Hollywood, the broken ones heading away from it, the vast majority caught somewhere in between. It was during this period, in the spring of 1950, that Clint met Maggie Johnson at a blind date arranged by mutual friends. She was working at a manufacturing plant in Linwood, a beautiful young woman with dark hair and a direct gaze that cut through his usual reserve. There was something about her certainty, her groundedness, that drew him in. While he was still figuring out who he was, she seemed to know exactly what she wanted. They began dating seriously, and for the first time, Clint felt the pull of conventional stability, marriage, a steady job, a house in the suburbs. But history had other plans. The Korean War erupted in June 1950, and by 1951, Clint's draft number came up. On a gray morning in March, he reported to Fort Ord, a sprawling military base in Monterey County, California, not far from the communities where he'd grown up. The Army wanted to make him a swimming instructor, capitalizing on his lifeguard experience. It was safe duty, far from the frozen hills of Korea where American boys were dying by the thousands, but it wasn't what Clint had imagined when he thought about military service. Fort Ord became another way station in his peripatetic life, but also something more, a chrysalis, though he didn't know it yet. The base housed not just soldiers but also a strange collection of misfits who'd found their way into entertainment-related duties. There were actors in uniform, radio operators who dreamed of Hollywood, photographers who'd worked in studios. During off-duty hours, they talked about the industry, about the magic that happened just a few hours north in Los Angeles, about the transformation of ordinary people into icons on silver screens. Clint listened, said little, but absorbed everything. He began watching movies differently during the weekend screenings on base, studying not just the stories but the actors, how they moved, how they used silence, how presence could matter more than dialogue. Something was crystallizing in him, a possibility he'd never seriously considered before. Not as a concrete plan, but as a whisper, a what if that grew louder with each passing month. And then came September 1951, and an incident that would change everything, though he wouldn't understand its significance for years to come. A routine training flight in a Douglas AD bomber that turned into a nightmare over the Pacific Ocean, where the boundary between life and death became as thin as the fog that had followed him since childhood. Chapter 2: Swimming Toward Shore. The Douglas AD Skyraider was a beast of an aircraft, designed to carry bombs and torpedoes, built like a tank with wings. On that September afternoon in 1951, Clint sat in the rear seat as a passenger, hitching a ride from Seattle back to his base at Fort Ord. The pilot was a Navy aviator he barely knew, confident and experienced, the kind of man who made flying look as casual as driving. They lifted off from Payne Field north of Seattle, the propeller roaring as they climbed into the coastal sky. Somewhere over Point Reyes, about 30 miles north of San Francisco, the engine began to sputter. Not dramatically at first, just a hiccup, a misbeat in the mechanical rhythm that had been steady since takeoff. Clint felt it before he heard it, a subtle shift in the vibration that traveled through the airframe. The pilot's shoulders tensed, his head tilting slightly as he listened to something only he could interpret. Then the coughing grew worse, the engine choking like a drowning man fighting for air. "We've got a problem," the pilot said, his voice crackling through the headset with forced calm. "Fuel contamination, I think. We're going down." The ocean spread below them, gray-green and endless under the late afternoon sun. Clint looked out at the water, at the white caps that from this height looked like decorative frosting, and felt a strange detachment wash over him. Not fear exactly, but a crystalline clarity, as if time had slowed and sharpened every detail. He was 21 years old, had survived the Depression, had made it through high school and into the army without ever really distinguishing himself, and now he was going to die in the Pacific Ocean because of bad fuel. The pilot aimed for the water, trying to control their descent, but control was an illusion. They hit hard, the impact slamming through Clint's spine, his teeth clacking together, the world becoming a chaos of spray and screaming metal. The plane broke apart on impact, the rear section where Clint sat separating from the front. Cold rushed in. The water was maybe 60 degrees, cold enough to kill through hypothermia even if the crash didn't kill you first. Clint found himself in the water, the plane sinking beneath him with terrifying speed. His lifeguard training kicked in, overriding panic. He kicked off his boots, shed his heavy jacket, oriented himself toward the surface. When he broke through, gasping, the pilot was already there, struggling in the swells. The nearest land was Point Reyes, visible as a dark smudge on the horizon. They began to swim. For 3 hours they fought the Pacific. The current pulled at them, trying to drag them out to sea, toward the shipping lanes and beyond, toward the vastness where people disappeared without trace. Clint's arms burned, his legs cramped, his body temperature dropping degree by dangerous degree. The cold was worse than the exhaustion, seeping into his core, making his thoughts sluggish. He thought about Maggie, about his parents, about all the places he'd lived and left behind. He thought about dying in the water like this, anonymous and unremarked, just another training accident statistic. But his body kept moving. Stroke after stroke, breath after breath, the mechanical repetition of survival. He'd been swimming since he was a kid, had spent summers at pools and beaches, had that particular California comfort with water that came from growing up on the coast. Now it was saving his life. Slowly, agonizingly, the shore grew closer. The rocks of Point Reyes emerged from abstraction into reality, barnacled and sharp, beautiful and terrible. They crawled onto the beach as the sun was setting, both men shaking uncontrollably, barely able to stand. A ranger found them and got them to warmth and medical attention. Clint spent the night in a hospital bed, wrapped in blankets, his body trying to remember how to generate heat. The doctors said he was lucky. The word felt inadequate. He'd looked at death in the face, had felt its cold fingers on his skin, and somehow he'd made it back. Something shifted in him during that long night. Not immediately, not with the clarity of epiphany, but gradually, like film developing in a darkroom. He'd been drifting through life, taking what came, never reaching for anything, never risking enough to fail. The ocean had given him back his life, and now the question became, what was he going to do with it? When he returned to Fort Ord after his recovery, the base looked different. Not physically, but in significance. It was temporary, a way station, not a destination. His military service would end in 1953, and then what? The question that had been ambient became urgent. He started paying closer attention to those entertainment-oriented soldiers, asking questions instead of just listening. One of them, a photographer who'd worked at Universal Studios before his draft, told him stories about the studio system, about the contract players they'd sign, young, good-looking people who might never become stars but who filled out the background of movies, who learned the craft while drawing a salary. "You've got the look," the photographer told him one evening, studying Clint's face with professional assessment. "Tall, distinctive features, good bone structure. And you photograph well, I can tell. You ever think about acting?" Clint hadn't, not seriously. But the seed was planted, and it grew through his remaining months of service, watered by boredom and ambition he hadn't known he possessed. When he was discharged in 1953, he didn't head straight back to Los Angeles. Instead, he enrolled at Los Angeles City College again, this time taking business administration classes more seriously. But he also started visiting studios, asking questions, trying to understand how the industry worked. The Hollywood he encountered was a factory of dreams running at full capacity. This was the golden age of the studio system, where places like MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, and Universal controlled everything from production to distribution to exhibition. They churned out films with assembly line efficiency, maintaining stables of actors under long-term contracts. For every Humphrey Bogart or James Stewart at the top of the pyramid, there were hundreds of young hopefuls at the bottom, fighting for bit parts and hoping for their break. Clint married Maggie Johnson on December 19, 1953, in South Pasadena. She wore white lace, he wore a dark suit, and they promised each other forever with the optimism of young people who'd survived the war years and believed better times were ahead. They rented a small apartment, and Clint took a job digging swimming pools in the San Fernando Valley, his tall frame bent over a shovel, earning $2.75 an hour while he figured out his next move. Through a friend, he met Chuck Hill, a cameraman at Universal Studios who saw potential in this lanky, laconic young man with the distinctive squint. Hill helped Clint put together some test photos, taught him how to stand for the camera, how to find his light. The pictures were good enough to get him an interview with Universal's talent department in early 1954. The interview did not go well. The casting directors looked at him like he was a curiosity, interesting but problematic. Too tall. Jaw too prominent. Adam's apple too pronounced. Voice too soft, with a tendency to mumble. And that squint, was it affectation or genuine? They told him to take acting classes, maybe try again later. It was a polite dismissal, the kind Hollywood delivered thousands of times a day. But Clint persisted. He enrolled in acting classes at Universal Studios School, showing up faithfully even as he continued digging pools during the day. The classes were torture. He was naturally reserved, uncomfortable with the emotional exhibitionism that method acting demanded. While other students threw themselves into exercises, exploring their pain and vulnerability, Clint stood stiff and uncertain, his movements wooden, his line readings flat. The instructors shook their heads. He lacked range, they said. Lacked presence. Lacked the indefinable quality that separated actors from civilians playing pretend. Still, Universal signed him to a contract in May 1954, not because they saw star potential, but because he was cheap and presentable, useful for filling out crowd scenes and maybe, if he improved, handling small speaking roles. The contract paid $75 a week, barely enough to live on even with Maggie working, but it was a foot in the door. Clint Eastwood, contract player, reporting to Universal Studios, Lot 36, ready to learn his craft. His first credited role came that same year in Revenge of the Creature, a science fiction B-movie about a gill man captured from the Amazon. Clint appeared for approximately 30 seconds as a lab technician who gets a face full of a white rat. No lines. Just a reaction shot. When he watched the rushes, he barely recognized himself on screen. That tall, awkward man fumbling with a rodent didn't look like someone destined for stardom. It looked like exactly what it was, a contract player earning his keep. More bit parts followed through 1954 and into 1955. A sailor in Francis in the Navy, an uncredited ranch hand here, a pilot there. The roles were forgettable, and Clint was learning an uncomfortable truth. He wasn't very good. The camera captured his uncertainty, his discomfort with performing. Other young actors at Universal, Rock Hudson, Tony Curtis, Jeff Chandler, had charisma that translated to film. Clint had height and interesting features, but something essential was missing. In October 1955, Universal dropped him from his contract. The executives were polite about it, thanking him for his service, wishing him luck. The subtext was clear. He didn't have what it took. At 25 years old, married and struggling financially, Clint faced a choice. He could admit defeat, find steady work, build a conventional life. Or he could keep fighting for something he wasn't even sure he wanted, chasing a dream that seemed to recede with every rejection. Maggie watched him during this period, saw him wrestle with doubt and pride. She didn't push him either direction, just waited, her faith in him steady even when his own faith wavered. And Clint, remembering the cold Pacific water, remembering the choice between swimming and drowning, decided to keep swimming. Chapter 3. Riding in Circles. The years between 1955 and 1958 were a wilderness. Not the romantic kind that westerns depicted, all majestic vistas and noble struggles, but the mundane wilderness of uncertainty, of bills piling up, of a man in his mid-20s wondering if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Clint took whatever work he came, digging ditches for the Bethlehem Steel Company, pumping gas again like he had as a teenager, working as a lumberjack in Oregon, as a paper carrier, as anything that paid. Maggie worked too, as a model and at Industria Americana, a manufacturing company. Together they scraped by, their dreams deferred but not abandoned. Acting jobs came sporadically, crumbs from a table where others feasted. He appeared in B-movies with titles like Tarantula and never say goodbye. His roles so small they barely registered on screen. He was the tall guy in the background, the face in the crowd, the body filling space. Directors didn't learn his name. Casting agents cycled through him and forgot him before the day ended. He was interchangeable, disposable, one of thousands of good-looking young men in Los Angeles who thought they could be in pictures. But something was happening beneath the surface of these failures, a slow accumulation of knowledge. Clint watched everything on set, how directors worked with actors, how cinematographers framed shots, how crews operated with ruthless efficiency. He noticed which actors commanded attention and why, studied their techniques like a mechanic studying an engine. Most of all, he observed what didn't work, cataloging the affectations and clichés that made performances seem false. He noticed that the best screen presences weren't necessarily the most theatrical. Gary Cooper, for instance, did very little, spoke softly, moved economically, let the camera come to him rather than reaching for it. Spencer Tracy was similar, deceptively simple, trusting the material and his own authenticity. These men didn't act, in the conventional sense. They inhabited roles so completely that the performance became invisible. Clint filed this away, intuiting a path that might work for someone like him, someone who felt uncomfortable with theatrical displays. In 1958, his agent sent him to read for a new television western called Rawhide. CBS was developing this show to capitalize on the popularity of westerns, which had taken over the small screen. Gun smoke, wagon train, have gun, will travel. Audiences couldn't get enough of frontier stories, and the networks were racing to produce them. Rawhide would follow a cattle drive from Texas to Kansas, the same journey repeated each season, with new adventures along the trail. They wanted Clint for the role of Rowdy Yates, the ramrod, second in command to the trail boss. It wasn't the lead. That would go to Eric Fleming, a square-jawed actor with more experience and conventional star quality. Rowdy was younger, greener, the character who would learn and grow, while Fleming's ill-favor provided steady leadership. Clint read for the part without much hope. He'd been rejected so many times that disappointment had become his default expectation. But something clicked. Maybe it was his natural reticence, which read as stoic cowboy reserve. Maybe it was his height and the way he looked in western wear, lean and authentic, like he'd actually ridden the range. Maybe it was simply timing, the right person in the right place when the alternatives were worse. Whatever the reason, they offered him the role. The contract was for 7 years at $750 per episode. It was more money than he'd ever made, more security than he'd ever had. He signed. Rawhide premiered on January 9, 1959, in the coveted Friday night slot at 7:30 p.m. The theme song, with its iconic "Rollin', rollin', rollin'" refrain, became instantly recognizable. The show was a hit, not a phenomenon but solid, pulling respectable ratings week after week. Clint Eastwood, who'd been dropped by Universal as untalented, was suddenly on television screens across America, week after week, becoming a familiar face in millions of homes. But familiarity didn't mean satisfaction. The work was grueling, 12 to 14-hour days on location in the scrublands north of Los Angeles, the same dusty terrain standing in for everywhere from Texas to Montana. They shot episodes rapidly, sometimes completing one every 6 days, the schedule relentless. Clint rode horses until his legs ached, ate dust until it coated his lungs, repeated the same basic scenarios until they blurred together. Cattle stampede. Indians attack. Con man joins the drive. Woman causes trouble. Rescue someone. Defend something. The formula varied slightly but never fundamentally changed. Eric Fleming was professional but distant, aware that the network was grooming Clint to eventually take over the show. There was an underlying tension between them, unstated but real, the competition of men who had to work together while wanting different things. Fleming wanted artistic respect. Clint wanted opportunity. The show gave them both just enough to keep them showing up but not enough to feel fulfilled. Year followed year. 1959, 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963. Clint's face became synonymous with Rowdy Yates. Fans recognized him on the street, asked for autographs, treated him like a star. But he knew the truth. He was a television actor, which in the Hollywood hierarchy of the early 1960s meant second tier. Movie actors looked down on TV work as lesser, something you did when you couldn't make it in films. And the role itself was limiting. Rowdy was earnest and heroic, without edge or complexity, a character designed to be likable rather than interesting. Maggie gave birth to their daughter, Kyle, in 1968, but the date would come later in our story. During these rawhide years, Clint's marriage was stable on the surface, troubled underneath. He worked constantly, and when he wasn't working, he was tired. The intimacy that had drawn them together in their early 20s was eroding under the weight of routine and unspoken disappointments. They maintained appearances, attended industry events together, smiled for photographs, but privately they were drifting into separate orbits. By 1963, Clint was 33 years old and growing desperate. Rawhide was successful enough to keep getting renewed but not successful enough to make him rich or open doors to feature films. He was trapped in a comfortable prison, earning good money but going nowhere. The industry saw him as Rowdy Yates, a television cowboy, not a serious actor. When he auditioned for movie roles, he was politely turned down. Too associated with the show. Too tall. Too television. He began looking for ways out, ways around the constraints of his contract and his typecasting. He studied other actors who'd successfully transitioned from television to film, looking for patterns he could replicate. He saved money obsessively, knowing that financial security would give him leverage to take risks. And he waited, with the patience he'd learned during all those childhood moves, all those years of rejection, for an opportunity that might never come. Then, in late 1963, something strange happened. His agent received an inquiry from Italy, from a director named Sergio Leone who was making a Western and wanted an American actor for the lead. The script was odd, violent, cynical, not at all like the wholesome adventures on Rawhide. The character was called Joe, though the Italian title translated to A Fistful of Dollars. The pay was terrible, just $15,000 for 3 months of work. The production would shoot in Spain, standing in for Mexico and the American Southwest. Nobody in Hollywood had heard of Sergio Leone. The whole thing seemed like a step backward, maybe even career suicide. But Clint read the script during a break-in, Rawhide filming, sitting in his trailer while the California sun baked the landscape outside. The character spoke very little, operated in moral gray areas, survived through cunning and violence rather than nobility. It was everything Rowdy Yates wasn't: dark, complex, existential. The script was spare, almost minimalist, leaving room for the actor to fill in the character through presence rather than dialogue. He thought about it for days, weighing the risks. If he took the role and the film flopped, which seemed likely for a low-budget Italian Western, he'd have wasted 3 months and possibly damaged his reputation. The rawhide producers wouldn't like him taking outside work during hiatus. His agents thought he was crazy to even consider it. Maggie was skeptical. Everyone advised against it. But Clint remembered swimming toward shore, remembered choosing to keep fighting even when Universal dropped him. The safe choice was to stay with rawhide, ride it out, hope for something better eventually. The risky choice was to go to Italy, work with an unknown director, try something different. In early 1964, he booked his flight to Rome. Chapter 4: The Man with No Name. Rome in early 1964 was a city of contrasts. Ancient ruins standing beside modern traffic, espresso bars next to medieval churches. A place where time seemed to layer rather than replace itself. Clint stepped off the plane at Fiumicino Airport into warm Mediterranean air that smelled nothing like California, carrying a small suitcase and a growing sense that he'd made a terrible mistake. The production company had sent a driver who spoke minimal English, and they navigated the chaotic Roman traffic in near silence. Clint watching a foreign city blur past the window while wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Sergio Leone turned out to be a bear of a man, over 6 feet tall and weighing close to 300 pounds, with a thick beard and eyes that burned with manic intensity when he talked about cinema. He spoke almost no English, conducting their initial meeting through an interpreter, gesturing wildly as he explained his vision. The film, Leone said, would be different from American westerns, not about good versus evil, but about survival and self-interest. The hero wouldn't be a hero in the traditional sense. He would be a mercenary, a manipulator, a man motivated by money rather than justice. "You will speak very little," Leone said through the interpreter. "Your face will speak. Your eyes. The audience must see you thinking." They showed Clint the wardrobe they'd assembled: a weathered poncho, a flat-brimmed hat, a thin cigarillo to clench between his teeth, boots with spurs. He looked at these items spread out on a table in the costume department, and felt something click into place. This wasn't Rowdy Yates. This was something new, something he could inhabit completely precisely because it was so undefined. The production moved to Almeria in southern Spain, a desert landscape so reminiscent of the American Southwest that it had become a favorite location for European westerns. The village they built there, a dusty collection of adobe buildings and wooden facades, looked more authentic than many Hollywood western towns. The Italian and Spanish crew worked with passionate chaos, everyone talking at once, the set loud and disorganized in a way that would never happen on a controlled American production. Leone directed like a conductor leading an orchestra, sometimes lying on the ground to get the right camera angle, sometimes climbing onto structures to demonstrate how he wanted actors to move. He was obsessed with composition, with creating images that had the mythic quality of comic books or opera. He wanted extreme close-ups of Clint's eyes, wide shots that reduced humans to small figures in vast landscapes, medium shots that emphasized the tension in his body language. "Less," Leone would say repeatedly through his interpreter. "Do less. Think more. Let the camera see you think." It was the opposite of everything Clint had been taught in acting classes, where emotion and expressiveness were valued. Leone wanted restraint, wanted the audience to work to understand what the character was feeling. He wanted mystery, not clarity. And somehow, Clint understood this instinctively. His natural reticence, which had been a liability in conventional acting, became an asset. His discomfort with theatrical displays became steely reserve. His tendency to squint in the bright sun became an intimidating glare. The script was thin, scenes barely sketched out. Leone would often decide on the day of shooting how a sequence would play, choreographing gunfights like ballet, finding visual poetry in violence. Ennio Morricone, a relatively unknown composer, had created a score unlike anything Clint had ever heard in a western: haunting whistles, electric guitars, whip cracks, operatic vocals. It sounded avant-garde and primal at once, elevating the film beyond its low budget. The supporting cast was a mix of Italian, Spanish, and German actors, all dubbed later into their respective language markets. John Maria Vallant played the villain with theatrical intensity that contrasted perfectly with Clint's minimalism. Marianne Koch was the damsel, though even she was more complicated than typical Western women, complicit in the corruption around her. Everyone smoked constantly between takes, argued passionately about trivial details, then laughed and embraced like family. Clint felt strangely liberated. In Hollywood, everything was controlled, calculated, focus-grouped. Here, Leone was following his artistic vision without compromise, creating something that might be brilliant or might be unwatchable. It was impossible to tell during production. The director pushed Clint physically, making him ride hard, fight in the dust, perform his own stunts. There was no safety coordinator hovering, no insurance company limiting risk. It was dangerous and exhilarating. The iconic gunfight choreography emerged from collaboration between Clint and Leone. The quick draw at the end needed to feel different from every Western shootout audiences had seen. They practiced the moves repeatedly: the stance, the hand hovering over the gun, the sudden draw, the opponent's delayed reaction. Leone filmed it with extreme close-ups of eyes, hands, gun leather, cutting between these details to stretch seconds into minutes of tension. When Clint finally watched the edited sequence months later, he barely recognized it. Leone had transformed a simple gunfight into something operatic and dreamlike. The shoot wrapped after 3 months, and Clint returned to Los Angeles sunburned and uncertain. He'd enjoyed the experience, had felt creatively alive in a way, rawhide, never allowed, but he had no idea if the film would be any good. He went back to the cattle drive, to Rowdy Yates, to the familiar grind of television production. Months passed. He heard nothing from Italy. Then, in November 1964, Per un pugno di dollari, a fistful of dollars, opened in Italy. It was a phenomenon. Audiences who'd grown up on American westerns embraced this darker, more cynical vision. The film broke box office records, played in theaters for months, made Sergio Leone famous overnight. Suddenly, everyone in the Italian film industry wanted to work with the tall American actor with the distinctive squint. Leone called. He wanted to make another Western with Clint, a bigger production with a larger budget. For a few dollars more, he called it. Same character, still unnamed, still operating in moral gray areas, but with a partner this time, played by Lee Van Cleef, a character actor Clint knew from Hollywood. The money was better this time, $50,000 plus a percentage of the Italian box office. Clint negotiated permission from CBS to take another hiatus from Rawhide and return to Spain in spring 1965. The second film was even more ambitious, a complex revenge story with a nonlinear structure, more characters, bigger set pieces. Leone's confidence had grown with success, and he pushed further into his stylistic experiments. More extreme close-ups. Longer takes building unbearable tension. More creative violence. The musical pocket watch that played during key scenes, becoming a haunting motif. Then Cleve and Clint developed a chemistry on screen, two taciturn men communicating more through glances than dialogue. For a Few Dollars More was another massive hit in Europe when it released in December 1965. Clint Eastwood was now a major star in Italy, Spain, Germany, France, everywhere except America, where nobody had seen these films. United Artists had the U.S. distribution rights but was hesitant. These weren't traditional westerns. They were too violent, too strange, dubbed into English from Italian. Would American audiences accept them? Leone didn't wait for American distribution to begin his third film. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly would be his masterpiece, he declared, an epic set during the Civil War, following three gunslingers searching for buried Confederate gold. Clint would play the good, though the character was barely more moral than his opponents. Eli Wallach, a respected American character actor, would play the ugly, a talkative Mexican bandit. Lee Van Cleef returned as the bad, a psychopathic mercenary. The production in 1966 was enormous by European standards, massive battle scenes with hundreds of extras, explosions, elaborate sets. They filmed across Spain, each location chosen for its mythic visual quality. The final three-way standoff in a circular cemetery took days to shoot, Leone obsessing over every detail. The placement of each gravestone, the angle of the sun, the rhythm of the editing that would make three men standing still feel like the most exciting moment in cinema. Clint was exhausted when he returned to America in late 1966. Rawhide had been cancelled while he was away, Eric Fleming having left after the seventh season and the show unable to survive without both leads. The cancellation freed Clint from his television contract but also eliminated his steady income. He was 36 years old, famous in Europe, unknown in America, with an uncertain future. Then, in early 1967, United Artists finally released A Fistful of Dollars in the United States. The critics were mostly dismissive. This was a cheap European knockoff of American westerns, they said, too violent and amoral for respectable audiences. But something unexpected happened in the theaters. Young people came, saw something that felt fresh and dangerous, and came back. They brought friends. Word spread. The film played and played, eventually grossing over $14 million domestically. For a Few Dollars More followed later that year. Then The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in late 1967. Each film built on the success of the previous one. By 1968, Clint Eastwood was suddenly one of the biggest box office draws in the world. Not through the traditional Hollywood route of studio grooming and careful image management, but through a strange detour to Europe, through collaboration with an Italian director who barely spoke English, through a character who had no name but a face everyone recognized. The irony wasn't lost on Clint. Hollywood had rejected him as untalented, as too limited, as lacking star quality. Now the same studios that had dismissed him were competing for his services, offering him leading roles in major productions. The town that had made him feel like a failure was treating him like a conqueror. But Clint had learned something crucial during those years of rejection and those months in Spain. The industry's opinion of you could change overnight, based on factors often beyond your control. What mattered was having your own vision, your own standards, your own sense of what you wanted to create. Leone had taught him that a strong directorial vision could transform even limited resources into art. He'd also shown him that there was power and restraint in what you didn't show, in making audiences work to understand you. As 1968 dawned, Clint Eastwood stood at a crossroads. He was finally a movie star, but what kind of movie star would he be? Chapter 5: The Director's Chair. Hollywood in 1968 was a town in transition, the old studio system crumbling as a new generation of filmmakers emerged from film schools and television, bringing fresh perspectives to an industry that had grown stale. Into this moment of transformation stepped Clint Eastwood, no longer the struggling contract player or the television cowboy, but an international star with leverage and ambition. The question was what he would do with it. The offers came flooding in, studios wanting to capitalize on his European success, to replicate the man with no name in American productions. But Clint was selective, aware that he could easily be typecast into the same narrow role endlessly. He chose Hang 'Em High as his first post-Leone Western, a transitional film that gave American audiences the revenge-driven gunslinger they expected but with more moral complexity than traditional Hollywood Westerns allowed. It was a massive commercial success, grossing over $11 million and confirming that Clint's appeal wasn't limited to art houses showing Italian imports. Then came Coogan's Bluff. In 1968, his first collaboration with director Don Siegel, a veteran craftsman who'd been making tight, efficient crime films for decades. Siegel recognized something in Clint beyond the Western persona, an ability to embody contemporary masculinity, flawed and complicated. They would work together 5 times over the next decade, developing a creative partnership built on mutual respect and minimal bullshit. Siegel taught Clint about directorial economy, about how to tell stories without wasted shots or unnecessary dialogue, lessons that would prove invaluable later. But it was Dirty Harry, in 1971, that transformed Clint from star into cultural phenomenon. As Detective Harry Callahan, a San Francisco cop hunting a serial killer while battling bureaucratic constraints and liberal reforms he viewed as handcuffing police, Clint created a character that ignited passionate debate. Was Harry a fascist fantasy, as critics like Pauline Kael argued, or a necessary response to rising crime and urban chaos? The film touched raw nerves in an America fractured by Vietnam, civil rights struggles, and generational conflict. The iconic line, "Do I feel lucky? Well, do ya, punk?" delivered with Clint's .44 Magnum pointed at a criminal's face, became instant cultural shorthand for a particular kind of masculine certainty. But what made the performance complex was the weariness underneath the toughness, the sense that Harry had seen too much and lost too much to believe in easy solutions. Clint played him not as a superhero but as a man corroded by his work, isolated and bitter, effective but damaged. Dirty Harry was a massive hit, and like Leone's westerns, it spawned sequels and imitators. But Clint was already thinking beyond acting. During the production of Dirty Harry, he'd watched Siegel work, absorbing the mechanics of directing, how to work with cinematographers, how to pace a scene, how to get performances from actors, how to keep a production on schedule and under budget. The process fascinated him more than the performance did. In 1971, Clint directed his first film, Play Misty for Me, a psychological thriller about a disc jockey stalked by an obsessed fan. He cast himself in the lead, but the film was really about testing his abilities behind the camera. He worked with a small budget and a tight schedule, proving to himself and the industry that he could deliver a professional product efficiently. The film was profitable and competent, earning respect if not raves. More importantly, it gave Clint confidence. He could do this. He could tell stories his way. The 1970s became a period of experimentation and consolidation. He formed his own production company, Malpaso, giving himself unprecedented control over his projects. He directed High Plains Drifter in 1973, a supernatural western that deconstructed the genre's myths about heroism and justice. The film was darker than his Leone westerns, the mysterious stranger not just morally ambiguous, but possibly a vengeful ghost. Critics were divided, but audiences responded to the film's nightmarish intensity. The outlaw Josie Wales, in 1976, represented an artistic breakthrough, a sprawling epic about a Missouri farmer turned Confederate guerrilla who refuses to surrender after the Civil War ends. Clint directed and starred, creating a character arc that moved from revenge to redemption, from isolation to community. The film had moments of humor and tenderness rare in his work, suggesting emotional range that his tough guy image often obscured. It was his personal favorite among his early directorial efforts, the film where he felt he truly found his voice as a filmmaker. But commercial success didn't mean critical acceptance. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, most serious critics dismissed Clint's work as reactionary, simplistic, appealing to audiences' worst instincts. The cultural arbiters who'd embraced European auteurs and the new Hollywood directors saw him as a genre hack, popular but unimportant. The disrespect stung more than Clint admitted publicly. He'd worked hard to develop his craft, to make films that were more than just star vehicles, yet the establishment treated him like a Neanderthal. He responded not with anger but with persistence, continuing to direct films that interested him regardless of critical opinion. Bronco Billy, in 1980, was a gentle comedy about a modern-day Wild West show, far from his tough guy image. Firefox, in 1982, was a Cold War thriller. Honky Tonk Man, in 1982, featured him as a dying country singer, vulnerable and fading. These weren't blockbusters, but they demonstrated range, a willingness to risk failure in pursuit of different kinds of stories. The 1980s brought personal turmoil alongside professional evolution. His marriage to Maggie finally ended in 1984 after years of infidelities and growing apart. He had relationships with various women, fathered children with different partners, conducted his private life with a discretion that protected him from tabloid destruction, but left a trail of complications. He wasn't a saint, wasn't particularly enlightened about relationships, but he took care of his responsibilities and maintained connections with his children, however unconventional the arrangements. Then came 1992 and Unforgiven, the film that changed everything. Clint had been holding on to the David Webb People's screenplay for years, waiting until he was old enough to play William Money, an aging killer trying to escape his violent past for a quiet life farming pigs with his children. The film was a deconstruction of everything the Western genre represented. Violence wasn't clean or glorious but ugly and traumatizing. Heroism was mythology obscuring brutal reality. The frontier was a place where people destroyed each other and themselves. Clint directed himself with unflinching honesty, showing money as diminished and uncertain, nearly killed trying to mount a horse, beaten savagely by the corrupt sheriff played by Gene Hackman. The film's violence, when it came, was horrifying rather than exciting. The final shootout wasn't triumphant but necessary and sad, Money reverting to his killer self because the world left him no choice, then disappearing into mythology as the closing title cards revealed he'd left Kansas with his children and wasn't heard from again. Unforgiven, won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. At 62 years old, 38 years after being dropped by Universal as untalented, Clint stood on the Oscar stage holding the industry's highest honor. The critics who'd dismissed him for decades had to reassess. This wasn't a fluke. This was a masterwork by a filmmaker who'd been learning his craft in public for 2 decades, building toward this moment of perfect synthesis between subject and style. The late career renaissance continued. Mystic River, in 2003, was a dark meditation on trauma and masculinity in working-class Boston. $1 Million Baby, in 2004, which he directed and starred in alongside Hilary Swank and Morgan Freeman, was a devastating story about a female boxer and her trainer that built to an ending of such moral complexity that audiences argued about it for years. It won 4 more Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director again. Gran Torino, in 2008, felt like a final statement on the tough guy persona that had defined his career. Playing Walt Kowalski, a racist Korean War veteran who slowly bonds with his Hmong neighbors, Clint created a character who embodied everything problematic about his screen image: the violence, the prejudice, the isolation, then deconstructed it, showing how such men were shaped by war and loss, and how redemption might come through sacrifice. The film grossed over $270 million worldwide, proving that at 78 years old, he remained a massive commercial draw. He kept working, kept directing, even as he aged into his 80s and 90s. American Sniper, in 2014, became his highest-grossing film, a morally complex portrait of Navy SEAL Chris Kyle that neither glorified nor condemned his subject. Sully, in 2016, examined heroism through the story of pilot Chesley Sullenberger landing a damaged plane on the Hudson River. The Mule, in 2018, featured Clint at 88 playing a 90-year-old drug courier, still willing to examine flawed masculinity and bad choices. In 2021, at 91 years old, he directed Cry Macho, a western about an aging rodeo star and horse breeder hired to retrieve a young man from Mexico. The film was not a commercial success, but its existence was the point. Clint Eastwood, the man Universal had dismissed in 1955, was still making movies on his own terms, still climbing into the director's chair, still finding stories that interested him. Looking back across nearly 7 decades in the industry, the arc of Clint Eastwood's career revealed something essential about persistence and evolution. He'd survived by adapting, by learning from every rejection and setback, by refusing to accept anyone else's assessment of his limitations. The man who couldn't act according to conventional wisdom had become one of cinema's most durable stars. The television cowboy dismissed as second-tier had created some of the most iconic characters in film history. The action star critics scorned as a reactionary had directed films of genuine moral complexity and artistic achievement. He'd swum toward shore when drowning seemed certain. He'd kept swimming when everyone said he'd never make it. And he'd kept swimming long after most people would have been satisfied to rest on the beach, comfortable and celebrated. Because for Clint Eastwood, the journey had always been the point, not arriving, but the endless process of testing himself, learning his craft, finding new challenges. The sun was setting over Carmel, California, where Clint had once served as mayor and where he now lived quietly between projects. The Pacific Ocean spread before him, the same ocean that had nearly killed him in 1951, now peaceful and golden in the evening light. Somewhere in that water was the young man who'd fought for his life, who'd crawled onto the beach exhausted and reborn. Somewhere in Hollywood was the struggling actor who dug swimming pools and wondered if he'd wasted his life. And here, now, was Clint Eastwood, director, actor, producer, icon, still working, still creating, still swimming toward shores only he could see. The story wasn't over. It might never be over. As long as there were cameras and stories and the possibility of one more film, the kid from the Depression who'd learned that you survived by moving forward would keep moving. Always forward. Always swimming. Always reaching for the next horizon.